yesterday we got up to 36B, the entire 36A. Um, so let's just go over what we did yesterday. We started on 35B where we talked about when an esrog is niklaf, if it's peeled, and the Gemara had quoted the Mishnah about an esrog that's peeled and that it's invalid. And the Gemara then said that Rava says that if an esrog is peeled like a red date, he says it's kosher. So the Gemara said that's a contradiction from the Mishnah where it says it's invalid. And the Gemara's answer was that there's a difference between peeling it in its entirety or peeling it partially. If it's peeled in its entirety, it's kosher. If it's peeled partially, then it's a problem. It's called menumer. It's spotted. And what comes out is that you do have an easy option, an easy way out. If you do have this problem, if your esrog is missing some of the peel, what is the way around this problem? Peel the rest of it. If you peel the entire thing, you now have a kosher esrog. If you leave it partially peeled and partially not peeled, then you have a spotted esrog, which is invalid. So that was Rashi's interpretation. That was on the top line on 36A. Rashi's interpretation that if it's bekula, it's completely, it's kosher, but if it's partially, that's where it's going to be invalid. The Tues brings Rabbeinu Hananel, who learns the opposite, that the Gemara's differentiation is that there's a difference between completely peeled and partially peeled, is that if it's partially peeled, that's when it's kosher. If it's completely peeled, then it's invalid. Come out that if you have a partially peeled esrog or if you have a completely peeled esrog, you'll have a machloikas between Rashi and Rabbeinu Hananel if you're allowed to use that esrog. Comes out a major machloikas in din between Rashi and Rabbeinu Hananel based on the fact that the Gemara is vague in its answer. Which one is which? The Gemara doesn't say. It just says this is if it's completely peeled, this is if it's partially peeled. So according to one opinion, partially peeled is kosher. According to the other one, partially peeled is not kosher. Same thing as completely peeled. According to one, that's kosher. According to the other, it's not kosher. So that is the story. Now, what is the reason of Rabbeinu Hananel that it wouldn't be kosher if it's completely peeled? That's not menumer. That's not spotted. It's all, it looks all equally. It looks all the same color. So what would the reason? Rashi gives like an explanation. If it's partially peeled, partially not peeled, then what you end up having is it's spotted, different colors and different spots. But if it's completely peeled, it would seem like it would have a similar look, the entire esrog. And so the understanding of Rabbeinu Hananel is that Rabbeinu Hananel connects it to the future Gemara, the Gemara that mentioned, that talks about right a little afterwards. It talks about comparing the laws of esrog to the laws of the animals that are treifos, that are considered to be animals that are going to die, and they're called the torn apart animals, and the different blemishes and wounds on different wounds, I would say, on animals are considered, make it non-kosher, and that's where the word treif comes from. And so similar laws apply to esrog. The Gemara's understanding an esrog to be similar to these laws of treifas, which is a very interesting comparison. Treifa is connected to an animal, and it's specifically, bringing something on the mizbeach, and the esrog is a it's a mitzvah, but what is the real comparison to the health of an animal and the esrog? It does seem interesting, but the Gemara does compare the two. You could maybe connect it to the idea that we've saw in the past that the concept of the Daled Minim is to be meratza Hashem, to appease Hashem. It's almost like the purpose of the carbon. The esrog, in a certain sense, has an element of a carbon to it, and therefore the laws of Trefus could maybe apply. I'm just thinking that maybe there's some connection there, because we did see a while back that the laws of mitzvah haba ba'avera, there was an opinion that said that when you have a case of a mitzvah that is done, that it's done while doing an avera as a problem, it only applies to mitzvahs haboyim laratzos. Only applies to mitzvahs that are meant to appeal to Hashem, that concept is applicable to karbanos and to esrog, and so we see that esrog is a concept of appealing to Hashem, and that would seem to be similar. Would make the laws of sacrifices maybe like an esrog is in a certain sense similar to a sacrifice. I'm just an interesting comparison. But anyway, that would be the logic. And Tues, this is not my own insight about the reason of Rabbeinu Hananel. Tues says that it's medame le b'shmaitzin. He compared the letrefes medame le b'shmaitzin. That Rabbeinu Hananel says the reason why you would explain it this way is because it's similar to trefes. Now, all I added was that this maybe is a connection to a previous commentary that we saw, that it makes the Daled Minim similar to like sacrifices. But in any event, the Gemara compares it, which we'll soon see, or tries to compare it to the laws of Trefus. Now, the Gemara then said that if it's nistak or nikev, if it has a hole, that Mishnah, the Gemara quotes the Mishnah, that such a case is invalid. And the Gemara brings, it says, Ula bar Chanina. Ula bar Chanina taught that there are other cases. The Mishnah's case was if it was punctured and it's missing something, it's invalid. If it's not missing anything, it's kosher. That was the Mishnah's case. Ula bar Chanina comes along, and he says, actually on the side they say it's Ula bar Chinana. Okay, that Ula bar Chinana says that if it's a puncture that goes through and through, that also will make the esrog invalid. And if it's not going through and through, then you have the measurement that if it's the size of a coin called an Isser coin, that's how big this peg is that punctured the esrog. So even though the esrog is not missing anything, but if it makes such a wide type of puncture, that also would be a reason why it is invalid. And bottom line is that Ula bar Chinana is adding or qualifying the Mishnah's law. The Mishnah said it's invalid only in a case where it's going to cause there to be part of the esrog missing. And Ula bar Chinana adds that no, there are cases where something's not missing. If you reach a certain threshold, those also will make it invalid. What is the threshold to make it invalid? It's if it's a puncture all the way through, or if it's the width of the size of an Isar, that is both of these cases will end up causing it to be invalid. So what was the Mishnah talking about where it says that it's valid if it's not missing anything? The Mishnah says it's kosher if it's not missing anything. What are you telling me, Ula, that it's going to be invalid? The Mishnah says it's valid if it's not missing anything. Yeah, Ula's explaining that the Mishnah, when it says it's going to be valid if it's not missing anything, that is when it's not the width of the size of a coin called an Isar, and it doesn't go all the way through, that would be a case where it will be kosher, and that's what the Mishnah is talking about. But if it doesn't meet those those rules, that criteria, then it actually will be invalid. Okay. Now Rava comes along and asks this question, and this is where the Gemara compares the laws of Treifa to the laws of Esrog. Rava says, what happens if the Esrog has simanim of a Treifa? What would be the law? And the Gemara goes through a lot of different options of what might be, what is he comparing the Esrog with a Treifa, with the law of an animal that's a Treifa, that's wounded and would be non-kosher to eat. Would that also make the Esrog considered to be non-kosher for an Esrog? Would it not be honorable for an Esrog? Would it be considered missing something? What would be the law if the same situation happened to an Esrog? What would be the halacha? The Gemara says, well, if we talk about niklaf, we talk about that it's peeled, and there is such a case by treifos that if the animal is peeled, meaning that its skin is no longer on the animal, that animal is called a treifa. It's called a gluda. That's the term used by an animal that is missing its skin. In fact, we had the word iglid ka'ahina, that it's peeled. Ahina was a red date. So the term in chulin is called an animal that's called a gluda. That is peeled, and the question is, what would happen if an esrog is that way? So the Gemara says, what do you mean? That we know. We already learned that a esrog that's peeled is invalid. Of course, it depends on depends on Rashi's pshat or Rabbeinu Hananel's pshat, but we learned about it, and it was so we know what the halacha is there. Of course, it depends kula mitzasa. It depends on completely peeled or partially peeled, and depends on how you follow, which opinion you follow. The Gemara says, okay, maybe Rava's question here again. We're talking about Rava's question that he's trying to compare esrog to a treifa, and he's asking what would be the halacha if it was similar. So, what case of treifa? And so then he goes to the next case. What about nistak? Nistak is by the animal. There's a concept if the trachea is cracked, and if it's cracked, of course, all the way from the top to the bottom. And Rava's question then would be, what would be if an esrog is cracked from the top to the bottom? So the Gemara says that's also tanina. We also learned about nistak in the Mishnah that it said it's invalid. And then you have, so the Gemara says, okay, maybe nikev. The nikev, maybe he's talking about nikev, that it's punctured. So we know that there's a halacha by the animal that if the membrane of the brain is punctured, it becomes a treifa. So the same thing, Rava's wondering about a puncture inside the esrog. Would the esrog be kosher or not kosher if it's punctured? And the Gemara says that also we learned about. We learned different halachas about esrog. If it depends on what type of a puncture, if it's mafulush or einai mafulush, and it's not missing anything. And so we do have a law about puncture. Now you have to keep in mind, not necessarily is it exactly the same as the law of a treifa. By a treifa, we do say by animals that even though it's missing nothing is missing from the animal, but the fact that the membrane is punctured, that is the membrane of the brain is punctured, that makes it invalid. Now, the esrog would have different halachas regarding puncture, and we saw already this completely punctured through and through, and the commentaries say would be similar to an esrog, that it's that the heart is that by an animal, it would be similar to an animal, that the heart. Tosis brings this, that there's a similarity really to the puncture of by the heart of the animal. That the law is that uh, um, that if it doesn't reach the hollow of the heart, so it's not a treifa. And the same thing would be maybe with an esrog, that if it's doesn't reach the area where there's seeds, where the seeds are, so that would be kosher. It wouldn't be it wouldn't be a problem. So if it does reach the seeds, then it's similar to a it's considered going through and through, and that would be a problem. And um, that would be that would be usher. In other words, there's a similarity to the esrog that's similar to a. There's a halacha that makes it similar to a brain. Membrane is punctured about an esrog, and there's a similarity to the halacha of a puncture by the heart, where in the esrog. What's the similarity to the esrog where it's similar to if the brain is punctured? That would be if the esrog is punctured all the way to the chadre hazera, where the seeds are. If it's punctured all the way till there, that would be similar to the brain being punctured, and the membrane of the brain being punctured. It would be invalid, even if it's not missing anything. This is the way Tysus understands it. But if it's punctured only up until there and not until there, then it would be similar to a puncture of the heart, and it would be considered that as long as it doesn't reach it doesn't reach the hollow of the heart, so it would be considered not a treifa, and it would be kosher. And now, so what comes out, it comes out that it's not saying clearly that it's invalid. Actually, would be valid, a nikev, if it's depending on where it reaches to. But the Gemara says that that's been discussed. So what are we talking about? What we're talking about here is the Gemara says, what is Rava's question? Rava's question really is about a lung, the law of a treifa of a lung that became liquefied. That's really what the question is talking about. If it's liquefied, like a where the law by Trefus regarding a lung is that there's a law if the flesh uh, inside the lung is liquefied, and nevertheless you have the bronchial tubes are still intact. So you got bronchial tubes intact. You got the flesh is liquefied, and the law is that in such a case it is kosher. However, if the bronchial tubes are not intact, if they also have dissolved and melted, they've become liquefied, it is a treifa. So the Gemara is asking, what would be the halacha by a esrog, that the flesh in the esrog, even though you have the bronchial tubes of the esrog. What are the bronchial tubes of the esrog? The comparison to the bronchial tubes are the seeds. If that area is still intact, but the flesh part has become liquefied, that would be very similar. And the question is, could we say it's kosher? Because by an animal, that would be kosher. And here we're wondering, it's basically going to be very mushy and liquefied and liquidy inside, and but you can feel that the seeds area, that area is still intact. So the Gemara says that what would be the halacha by the yesrid? Do we say that it's similar to to treifa, to an animal, or do we say that no, there's a big difference. The treifa animal, it's for the lung, which is not exposed, and the esrog is exposed to the ear, and therefore it's seruche misrachas. It's much worse. It's going to get ruined. It's not going to get better. And the by the lung, it could grow. It could heal itself, so to speak. And here it can't, and therefore we could say it's saruche misrachas. Saruche misrachas means it smells, or it's gonna smell. It's gonna become more mildewy and moldy and rotten, and so maybe nesrig is worse, and it should be invalid. Or maybe there's no difference, and we'll say that it's kosher. That's the Gemara's question. The Gemara tries to bring a proof. It brings a brisa that talks about an esrog tapuach or saruach. And it talks about other cases as well, kavush and shalok. And it talks about other cases as well, all different types of situations about an esrog. Tapuach, Rashi brings a few translations over here, tapuach and saruach. Tapach is the simple, or one of the translations of tapuach. Well, tapuch means an apple, but it also means it blows up. It's bloated or swelled, and saruach means like it's smelled, it's moldy, it's mildewy.
Yeah, isn't nafuach bloated or blown up? I don't know, but you know,
Yeah, maybe the word va'ata nafachta be, the word hafacha. It does mean blowing, but there is the tough would be a prefix to the word tapuach, that it blows up, and that it's blown up. But yeah, I don't know. The etymology is if it's nafach and the tough could be switched or something like that. Maybe we'll look it up. We'll have to look it up in a dictionary. But the tapuach is a term used for blowing up, and I don't know if exactly how it's related to nafuach. I mean, sounds like the same word, but I don't know exactly which one is the root. Or hafacha, peches, hey, maybe is the root. Anyway, but Rashi says, so the Gemara's initial understanding is that the Gemara says that, what do we see from here? That tapuach or saruach is considered invalid. And so what does the Gemara think? That tapuach must mean that the outside is, is whatever you want to translate tapuach to mean is the outside. In the saruach is the inside. In the saruach would be exactly what we're talking about, that the inside of the esrog has been liquefied, and that would be the case. And we see that it's invalid, even though by an animal it's kosher, by a by an esrog it's invalid, because that would be the case of saruach. The Gemara says no. We could translate them differently. Saruach doesn't mean the inside. They're both talking about the outer area of the esrog. That the idi v'idi mi bachutz. The Gemara's answer was, they're both talking about. We're talking about the outside of the esrog. The difference is this is where it's tafach, even though loisarach, which you could translate, it means it blew up, but it didn't get mildewy or rotten, and the other case is that it's sarach, even though like tafach, that it got rotten, but it didn't blow up, didn't swell, didn't get bloated. So so basically, we don't have a conclusion on our question of Rava regarding the case where an esrog is liquefied, or at least the flesh of it is liquefied. So that's the no. So I just wanted to mention. So Rashi translated tafach and sarach. So first he translates it that tafach, that like rain falls on it, the tafach, and sarach means nirkab. I think that when rain falls on it, I think he's translating it to mean it blew up. and sarach means it rotted. And then he brings another pshat that tafach means nirkav, that it rotted. Sarach means it has a bad smell because of the animals, because of teloim, worms that have eaten it. So that's sarach. Sarach is like it has a bad smell. But tafach would mean that that it's nirkav, that it rotted. So again, you could learn it either way. But the bottom line is the Gemara was really was relying on the sarach part to mean the inside, and the Gemara's answer is that sarach refers to the outer flesh of the esrog. Bottom line is that we don't have an answer to Rava's question if the laws of treifas apply to the esrog. I was bothered yesterday with the fact that we're considering the esrog open to the environment and the lung not open to the environment because to me it seems like the esrog is also closed. The skin is covering it over. So even though it's liquefied, but you have the skin of the esrog intact. So why is the Gemara saying that it's shalit ba'avira? The air it's open to the elements. It's not exactly open to the elements, but I guess what the Gemara means is that by a lung, it's inside the body. So even the entire lung is closed off. Not only the outer area of the lung and the flesh inside. In other words, the lung has two coverings. It has its own membrane that covers over, that's sort of like covering over the flesh that we're talking about, liquefied, and it's inside the body of the animal. I guess the esrog is, even though it has the skin, but it's still intact. Unless some of you had another understanding of that. That's what seems to me is the understanding here. What the Gemara's thought is. In truth, I'm also bothered with the fact that the Gemara seems to emphasize that. By the animal that it will heal itself, and the esrog, how is the esrog going to heal itself? It's been cut off from the tree. What would the thought be? Over there, of course, it can't heal itself. If that's if that's why it's kosher, because it's going to heal itself. So nothing to do here. It's not about shalit ba'avira. It's because it's cut off from the tree. That would be a reason why it's not going to heal. In other words, what's the emphasis here? That if it's going to heal itself or not, an esrog, it's not getting better. It was cut off from the tree. You want to use it for your mitzvah. It's not going to be kosher. It seems like, that would be the simple case. He's talking about it's cut off from the tree, so it's not getting better. So why do we have to bring this idea of seruche misrachas? Shalit ba'avira. The main thing is if it's hadar bari. It's not about shalit ba'avira. It's about attachment. This is attached. This is live, and this is dead. Yes, Jeffrey.
So I think that it looks like the cases where they were trying to preserve the esrog so that it might be able to be used another year. And so different things might have happened to it. And remember, we read that sometimes they tried to give it for the next generation because they weren't always sure they could come by them at the right time, right? And you even mentioned, when the holiday is in October, it's easier to have completed fruit than it might be if it's early in September and it's still summertime and it's still growing. So it seemed to me like maybe it's going to dry out in the air. Something. So it got wet. It was in the rain and it started to swell a little bit. But now it's going to dry out in the air. Or you're going to try to preserve it in some other way that's dry, so that it'll be better. Okay, and so that might be an improvement, even though it's already cut.
Right. So in other words, it's not really about healing. It's about that it actually will go through a change of drying out, which benefits it because it no longer is similar to a animal that's liquefied because it actually will dry out. Ultimately, it'll dry out. So you could say it might heal itself, so to speak.
Right.
Not really healing, but the issue will no longer affect it. And the Gemara's other thought is no, but it's Seruche Misrachas. It might not reach that. It'll actually start mildewing, and it won't help.
Right.
Okay, thank you, Jeffrey. That's a nice interpretation. Okay, good. So so the Gemara mentioned a number of different cases here. Interesting. It talks about an esrog that's kavush, that's in liquid. There's a very interesting some sofer that mentions that on Shabbos, don't leave your lulav in water. He says before Shabbos is over, make sure to have a goy remove it from the water. Why? He says because your lulav, if it's 24 hours in water, it's going to be kavush. It will be considered cooked, something that's soaked, like we know,
Marinated.
Marinate the different vegetables and things. It's considered cooked according to halacha, and you can't use a cooked esrog for the mitzvah. So the Chassam Sofer mentions in a tshuva that make sure to do the same thing as with your lulav, make sure that it's not cooked. People leave their lulavim in water over Shabbos. He says that could be a problem. It's going to be cooked. So I think his son Chassam Sofer has a whole there's a tshuva about how people came to him and said, how could this be an issue? Because it's not edible. The lulav hadassim and aravis is no issue of cooked. It's not something that's edible. Only something that's edible would you have if it's soaked in it for 24 hours. It would be a problem called kavush, and so it shouldn't be an issue. So it seems like it's not so clear. I don't think anyone is makbid on this. I don't think anyone is careful to follow the Chassam Sofer. I guess maybe because we follow his son, the Chassam Sofer, but there is such a discussion about leaving the lulav in water. Anyway, here it talked about kavush, the esrog being kavush. That could be a problem if you leave it in liquid. Interesting. Rashi translates kavush when he mentions the case of kavush. Rashi says, let me just pull up that Rashi here.
He says it's in
chometz.
In
Why
vinegar.
don't I see it? Chometz or bechardel, yeah.
Right.
So interesting that he says that, because in halacha, really, kavush is even in water. Rashi says if you put it into vinegar or mustard, chometz or chardel, which is vinegar or mustard, and the halacha really is kavush would apply to anything. Maybe Rashi's just being practical. That would be the practical thing that you might consider, like they do have in these shawarma places. They have these different or falafel places. They have lemons soaking in something. Maybe it's in some type of, maybe that's the common thing that you would soak it in, like vinegar or mustard. But the halacha is that it's even in water. The halacha of kavush applies if it lasts more than 24 hours.
So I was thinking that maybe it was like they discovered maybe in the 18th century that you could preserve certain things in formaldehyde. Remember when you used to see this? You go to a museum and there would be something preserved in a liquid that was a chemical, really. And
so you're saying maybe because of the next year, you're continuing your right, the way you're understanding it about keeping it for future. Maybe that's why you would be kavish it. Kavish, yeah, and then the other case of shaluk. Shaluk is an interesting word. It's some type of like sautéing or cooking, but it's seems to be it seems to be a contradiction if it's more than regular cooking or less than regular cooking. you know, the word shaluk, often you have mavushal and you have shaluk. You know, mavushal is regular cooking, and shaluk either means less or more. In different places, it seems to mean different things. So it's just like it's some type of a cooking, possibly like overcooking or a little less than cooking. It seems like there's different places where it means each place maybe according to its understanding. But here it seems to mean that it's cooked enough to be considered cooked. If it's less than that, it would probably be kosher. In other words, it's not invalid if just if it fell into your, let's say, your hot water china, your hot water heater. Let's say your esrog fell in for a moment and you quickly pull it out, would it be kosher? So the brisa here says shalok is a problem. That means that it's cooked more than usual shalok. But if it's just dropped in and fell and you pulled it out, it's not going to be a problem of considered that it's invalid. It's going to still be valid. That's why one of the commentaries says it specifically says shaluk, and that it's cooked more than usual. But if it's cooked less than usual, it's going to be kosher. It's going to be fine. Then we talked about kushi, which the Gemara is going to talk about. Lavan white, menumer is spotted, and now the Gemara talks about and kador is round. If it's like a ball, like the ball that kids play with, and it's not long like normal esrogim. There is another girsa here that says that it's like a ke'ein dud v'ogol kekadera, that it's
Yeah.
it's some type of a it looks like a pipe almost, where it's not fully round. It's a cylinder. That's what that's how they explain it. That, in other words, the word kador, the resh could be a dalet, could be mistaken for a dalet, or could be they mistaken the dalet for a resh. So according to that other girsa, that other version, it ends up meaning that it's like a cylinder, and it would be such a esrog. Kador is, well, if they translate it that it's like a dud, she'asi kein dud, it's like a dud.
Yeah, and the French word is flûte. So maybe like a flute shape.
Yeah, like a flute, maybe, yeah. But
like elongated but round.
They give an example here, like a kadera. Taisus over here, the bottom second to last Taisus, he says, also you come in dud va'ogol to kadera, like a pot. There's such a girsa that it's a dalid, not a resh. Anyway, that's this is in the this is the brisa that we brought. Some say even tiyum. Tiyum was that twin esrog, where it's like a Siamese twins that they're attached to each other, two esrogim attached to each other. Some say that's invalid. Now the esrog haboiser, it's not cooked completely. Truth is, we did have on Daf Lamed Aleph, this was a whole discussion over there about Rabbi Yehuda's opinion about the esrog that isn't finished its growing process. Is it a problem of hadar? The what was the case over there on page 31b? we brought what did the Gemara say? Esrog Hayashon, if it's old. Hayara Karti, if it's green. About it's not. Then it said sheer esrog katan, a small esrog. What's the measurement of it? And that was where we mentioned it, that it has to be at least the size of a walnut, the size of an egg. If it's not, it didn't finish its growing process. And a big one we had different. And then so here, what does the Brisa say? The Brisa says if it's boiser. Now, boiser, Rashi translates over here, boiser means that it's the size of a small bean, a white bean. Tosfos says boiser, that's when that boiser, size of a white bean, that's applicable for grapes. That boiser just means that it's a certain stage of its growth. If it's a certain stage of its growth, that doesn't apply. That doesn't, you can't just say that when it came to grapes, it meant that size. When it comes to an esrog that's double, triple, quadruple the size of a grape, it's not going to be the size. This boiser is not just the size of a white bean. It's going to be much bigger than the size of a white bean, and it's going to be called boiser. Boiser is a stage of growth. It's not a size. If it's a size, then it would be, yeah, then I could understand what you're saying, Rashi. But he says, no, it's a size, it's a stage of growth for a grape. That's what we said, that the size is a white bean. But boiser doesn't mean the size of a white bean. So Tosfos argues with the size. Obviously, it's talking about it's a little bigger, and it's bigger than that, and it's boiser, but it hasn't been boiser as a certain stage of growth that it didn't finish its growing process. And we have Rabbi Akiva saying it's invalid, and the Chachamim say it's valid. And the question would be, how do you connect this with the previous Mishnah that we quoted? We quoted on Lamed Aleph, and it was the Mishnah on Lamed Dalet. It was the Mishnah on page 34b, which mentioned that sheer esrog hakatan. Reb Meir says ke'egleis. Reb Yehuda says like an egg. How do you reconcile that with this? What is the minimum size of the esrog, and what is this argument here, Rabbi Akiva and the Chachamim, about a boiser, about this esrog that's boiser? So the commentaries struggle with this. This is the way Tosfos deals with this issue is that he says there's different types of esrogim, that there could be an esrog that's even bigger than those sizes, and still it's boiser. It still could be considered that it didn't reach its growth that it needs to reach. This is like a Floridian esrog. A Floridian esrog is supposed to reach a much bigger growth than a Californian esrog, than an Israeli esrog, because like the avocados in Florida are much bigger, and the esrogim here grow much bigger. So here, even though it reaches the size of the walnut or the size of the egg, but it's still boiser. It could be you cut it off the tree too early, and it could still be invalid. And that would be the argument between Rabbi Akiva and the Chachamim. If it's considered boiser, would that be a problem? Would that be invalid? So again, it reached the size. That's the way Tosfos seems to reconcile this. Again, it's you have to reconcile it with the Mishnah. The Mishnah's mentioned Reb Meir and Reb Yehuda about the minimum size of an esrog, and if it's interesting because the Gemara on Lamed Aleph talked about what the reason is. Why is Reb Yehuda saying that it needs to be the size of an egg? And the Gemara there talked about if it reached its growth, or if it has to do with hadar, beauty. So anyway, here the understanding is that it might, at least the way Taisa seems to understand it, is that it's an esrog that's supposed to grow a lot more. So it might have, even though it's the size of an egg, but it might be an esrog that is still considered boister, that it's not, hasn't grown enough. Okay, and there are other ways of reconciling it. Some of the other commentaries talk about this as well. The Gemara then the Gemara had brought this argument. Then it talked about growing it in a defus, in a type of form, and specifically mentioned you grew it in a mold, but made it into another creature, another creation, meaning that it doesn't look like an esrog, which pretty much implies, like, if it does look like an esrog, it will be kosher. It's if you, and the Gemara will spell that out. We'll soon see. Now, so anyway, we finished the Gemara about the case that's similar to the if we compare esrog to treifos, to animals. And then the Gemara talked about, after that, the Gemara talked about the esrog that's kushi, that's from Ethiopia. So I think maybe I'll just start with that inside the Gemara. We'll learn that again. Amar Mar, Master said, and that is about, we're on 36a. Again, I know we got up to 36b, but we went through it a little fast. So let's go over this 36a, about 15 lines, maybe like 12 lines from the bottom of the page. Amar Mar, Master says. So again, 36a, about 12 lines from the bottom of the page. Amar Mar, Master said, which is used when it means that we're quoting, we're mentioning something that was just brought up in the Gemara, that was brought up maybe a few lines earlier. As the Gemara says, Amar Mar. Let's talk about what Master just said. And Amar Mar, Master said, esrog kushi is puzzle, that an Ethiopian esrog is invalid. The Gemara asks, Tanya kushi kosher doimel kushi puzzle. But didn't we learn in a brisa different than this brisa? We just quoted a brisa that said that the esrog that's kushi is invalid, and there is another brisa that says an esrog that's kushi is valid. A kushi means Ethiopian, but if it's similar to Ethiopian, it's invalid. So the Gemara says, Amar Abaye. Abaye says, to answer the question, Ki tanan nami masnisin doimel kushi tanan. When the Mishnah says that it's when the Mishnah says that actually, we brought a brisa. Amar Mar is quoting the brisa, but that seemingly that's the what we're quoting. Abaye jumps to talk about our Mishnah, because in truth, our Mishnah also said this, that the kushi, the Mishnah said also that an esrog hakushi is invalid. Right? We have on page Lamed Dalet Amud Beis that the Mishnah had said that the case esrog hakushi puzzle. So it was on 34b, maybe 5 lines up from the bottom. Esrog hakushi puzzle. So some take out the word Amar Mar, that Master said. Actually, it's quoting the Mishnah only. Doesn't matter. You could quote the brisa, quote the Mishnah. Bottom line is, we have 2 sources that say it's invalid, and we have one source, a brisa, that says that a kushi esrog is valid, but if it's similar to a kushi, it's invalid. So what does Abaye answer? Kitanya nami masnisin doimel kushi tanan. That when the Mishnah said kushi is invalid, it meant if it's similar to a kush, to an Ethiopian esrog, but not if it's actually Ethiopian. An Ethiopian esrog itself, that would be kosher, because that's the normal growth of an Ethiopian esrog. And so if you have an Ethiopian esrog, that would be a kosher esrog. And if you have an esrog grown in Israel that looks like Ethiopian, that would be a problem. If you have an esrog grown in Morocco that looks Ethiopian, that's a problem, because that's not the norm. But if it is the norm, that would be okay. And that would be the understanding of Abaye, that a Ethiopian esrog is valid. If it's similar to Ethiopian, which means that it grew in a in an area where it should not be looking Ethiopian, and it does look Ethiopian, that's a problem. Now, the Gemara then says another answer. Rava Amar like kasha. Rava says it's not a kasha. A different answer. Halon v'halahu. This is for us. This is for them. For us is often means in Bavel, and for them means in Israel. And what does that mean? That there's a difference between what we're used to and what they're used to. And for us, the way at least Rashi over here says, Kushi is invalid, as the Mishnah says, because the Mishnah is talking about in Eretz Yisrael, which is far from Ethiopia, and they're not used to using it. And for them, that would be invalid because they don't think that that's a beautiful esrog. And the Brisa, which says that esrog, that's kushi, is valid, that would be for people who are familiar, who are used to using Ethiopia. We're close to Kush, and we're used to it. Nevertheless, if it's doimel kushi, if it grows over here and it looks like a kushi, that would also be invalid. So according to the understanding of Rava, because Rashi needs to add that point, because the Brisa says two things. It says kushi is kosher, doimel kushi is puzzle. If it's Ethiopian, it's kosher. If it's similar to Ethiopian, it's invalid. How do you reconcile that according to Rava? How do you explain that? So the way Rava's explaining it is for Babylonians, an Ethiopian esrog is kosher because we're used to it. It's familiar. Our country is near Ethiopia, and it's going to be something that we're familiar with. We see those type of esrogim around. We're not shocked by seeing it. So it's considered hadar. It's considered something that we are used to. We're familiar with it. We think it's nice. But the Brisa also says doimel kushi is not valid. How could that be? So it comes out that if it's grown normally and you're used to it, then it's kosher. But if it's grown abnormally, which means if the kushi esrog was grown, if you have an esrog grown in Eretz Yisrael that looks kushi, that looks bad, it looks raw, it looks different than it should, even though you're used to kushi esrogim, it's also going to be invalid because it has intrinsically a problem that it's not hadar. That intrinsically this is an esrog, even though you're familiar with such esrogim, but it has a problem that it grew abnormally. And the fact that I'm used to such esrogim, then it's that would be okay in Bavel. One of the commentaries in the back of the Gemara has a problem with this Gemara, this translation. He says Israel is closer to Ethiopia than Babylon. Now, I don't know my geography well, but that's what he asks. He says something's wrong over here. How do you reconcile that? He says it's the opposite of what we know in geography. So he wants to say that there's a difference between, he wants to translate it differently. Halon v'halahu is for people in Kush is one thing, and for people outside of Kush is for those people that's what's that's kosher for them. But for us, this is what's kosher. This is what's kosher for us. It depends on the people, not on the place. Which is different than the word. These words, halon v'halahu, is mentioned 500 times in Shas. It uses this 100 times in Shas, maybe. It mentions these terms. It always means this is Pharisees, all this bubble. But the Rashash here wants to say, but you know what? Here we're going to translate it differently. That here it goes by halon v'halahu means there it's applicable to the people of Ethiopia, and here it's for the people of outside. Anyway, bottom line is that a black esrog is not so simple. And if you get a black esrog, probably a problem because it probably didn't grow in Ethiopia, and it's probably something that's blemished from somewhere else. I didn't look in Shulchan Aruch what it says, but definitely be the talk of the town if you go to shul with it and everyone sees it. So I definitely don't think it's advisable. Probably not kosher, but because it probably grew. But it would be interesting to try planting sroigim in Ethiopia and see what they look like. Okay, now the next Gemara is Esrog HaBoiser Rabbi Akiva Paisel Chamachshirin. So the Gemara here is quoting that case, what's called Boiser, which I mentioned. Tosfos, Rashi, and Tosfos seem to have a little argument here about what Boiser is. Boiser a measure, a size of an esrog, which Rashi seems to translate it that way, that it's the same size that it says by grapes in the Gemara Brachos, that Boiser is the size of a poil halavan, a white bean. So Tosfos says that would be that size that we're talking about here, that Rabbi Akiva says is invalid, and the Chacham say is valid, and the other understanding that Boiser is a certain stage of its growth, that Rabbi Akiva says that it means it didn't finish its growth, and Rabbi Akiva says that whatever stage that is, it's invalid. The rabbis say it's valid. So Amar Rabba says Rabbi Akiva, Reb Shimon, Amru Davar Echad, Rabbi Akiva, Reb Shimon, they say one thing. Rabbi Akiva Hadamar, and we have Rabbi Akiva that we just saw, that he says that this Boiser Esrog, that this Esrog that is something wrong with it in size. However you learn, it hasn't reached its growth, that this Esrog is invalid. And we have Reb Shimon, Mahi, what is it? He talks about the laws of Meiser. He's the Tanan we learned in a Mishnah. The Gemara also, the Gemara here, it says the Tanya, but it's the Tanan. We learned in a Mishnah. They change it on the side. It's actually a Mishnah in Meisrus. It says Reb Shimon Paiteres Sroigim B'Koitnan. Reb Shimon exempts Sroigim that they're too young from separating Meiser. If they were harvested, then you are exempt from separating the tithing that goes that goes to the Levi, and I would assume you would be exempt from all the Meisers, the Meiser Sheni, Meiser Ani as well. So Amalei Abaye says that you want to compare. So the Gemara before Amalei Abaye. So the Gemara is implying, like Rabbi Akiva, Reb Shimon seemed to follow the same logic, that if it's too young, it's exempt from Meiser. It's not an esrog. It's not it's not a fruit. It's not considered a fruit yet. So the same way it's not a fruit regarding Meiser, it's not a fruit regarding an esrog. So Rabbi Akiva, Reb Shimon seem to follow the same line of thought. Now Amalei Abaye says Dilmolahi, maybe it's not true. I can like Rabbi Akiva hacha to be in hadar. Rabbi Akiva says here by esrog it has to be more matured, more grown better, because it has to be beautiful. It creates hadar. It says hadar, beauty. Veleka, and you don't have that. Aval Hasan, but there, regarding the laws of Maestris, maybe Karabanan Spirale, maybe Rabbi Akiva doesn't follow Reb Shimon. Maybe he follows the opposite view, the other view of the rabbis, that they say by an esrog katan, if it's young and you harvest it, it is going to be obligated in Meiser, even though it's young, because it's still fit to eat. Still get lemon juice out of it. So it would be still kosher. So maybe Rabbi Akiva agrees.
So
maybe Rabbi Akiva agrees with the rabbis and not with Reb Shimon. And so because there's really a difference. Here it says hadar, there it doesn't say hadar. So and inami, or also you could say that there's another adkan like Reb Shimon, that another difference, that Reb Shimon maybe doesn't agree with Rabbi Akiva, because Reb Shimon only says hasam over there. Ella dechsiv aser taser called vazarecha, that it says over there that you should tithe all the produce of your seeds, which the understanding is that you're only obligated in Meiser, in a way, things that are kederach shabnei adam mitzi and lizriya, things that people plant, that if you would plant it, it will grow. So only things that people will plant, because what will end up growing. And at this stage, an esrog that's so young, if you plant it, it's not going to grow. So he learns that there's a special law regarding Meiser that has to be able to grow more fruit. Aval hacha, but here regarding the Daled Mina, regarding esrog, that it's not about growing, it's about being a fruit. Maybe it was like the rabbis that this is called a kosher esrog. V'suloi midi, and now we turn the page. V'suloi midi, and conversation is over. That this is the end. The Gemara says that that's the story. You can't say that Rabbi Akiva, Reb Shimon are the same opinion. It's very possible that they disagree. We see two major differences. Let me just do one more minute. We'll do a little new piece. Yidloi b'defus, if you grew the esrog in a mold, v'asoi kamin bria acheres, and you made it like another bria. So if you grew it, this was the brisa. It said that you grew it inside a mold and you made it similar to something else. You made this esrog look like a house. You put it in a mold that looks like a house, and now you have a house esrog. Well, so you come in bria acheres, a different creature. Puzzle, it's invalid. Amar Rava says, Loishano ella kimin bria acheres. That Bryce is only talking about, it only means if you did it like something else. Aval kibriyasa kasha, if you made it like the shape of an esrog, that is going to be kosher, right? Now the Gemara says, Pshita, of course, isn't that the wording of the Brisa? What are you adding, Rava, to what the Brisa says? I mean, how much, we're not in kindergarten over here. You don't need to tell us that. The Brisa clearly says that if it's the size, if it's made into a different creature, that's when it's invalid. If it's the proper made into a form of an esrog, there's nothing wrong. Go make your molds and make them into the normal esrog. So the Gemara says, Pshita, kamin bria acheres, Tanya. The Brisa taught it in a way that it's only if it's invalid, it's only if it's in a different type of creation. But if it looks like an esrog, it's kosher. My answer is like tzricha. It's not necessary for Rava's statement, only for the following case: da avida dape, that you made it in a way. The way it's translated is dape. Rashi says crushim, beams or boards that you made with like lines. You made it in a way that has lines all the way along the height of the esrog, the height from the top to the bottom. There are many grooves, and so you might think that that's considered a bria acheres. So the Brisa comes along and tells Rava, the Brisa is not so clear. Rava comes along and says that it's only if it's a bria acheres. If it's this is not called a bria acheres. It's not called a different creation. This is similar to an esrog. It's close enough that it's not considered a bria acheres, and either in this is going to be kosher. All right, we're going to stop here. Sei gesund, everyone.
Thank you, Rabbi.
You're welcome.
I think that they learned how to train the branches of bushes. Like in France. Later on in the 17th century, they were very accurate. They would make lines of trees, and all the trees would have just the same shape, and they would adjust how they grew. They learned how to do this. I think that's what it's talking about. You make the whole tree of the, which is really more like a big bush, of the esrog, so it has shapes, so that it looks very beautiful because the branches only grow a certain way, and so the mold, the forma, is the word that Rashi uses, forma. So you're manipulating how the tree grows.
Right.
So it all has a certain shape. Or so,
right. So what you're saying is it's not only, they didn't do this just to each esrog, they did it to the entire tree.
Yes.
That's
correct.
Interesting. That I wouldn't have thought.
And so the whole tree looks like something different. Okay.
Right.
But it's supposed to be beautiful because they're very expert at having beautiful gardens for royalty. There's always someone walking in the garden. Right. Even
you wonder about the 21st, 21st century or 22nd century. How things are going to be. They're going to have everything. We're not going to be able to see trees anymore. Everything's going to be grown in these stuff. They might even create babies to look perfectly like the Gerber baby.
Correct.
Everyone is
correct.
Molded in a certain way.
Yeah. Exactly. But so I'm thinking about, where do you grow esrog? It might be in a beautiful garden, like you have jasmine, it smells beautiful at night, and it's worthwhile for the prince or somebody like, Rebbe. He has beautiful mosaics in his floor. He has beautiful garden also. So they would train the branches and everything. It would make certain kinds of shapes, whatever. So it would have an effect on the fruit. But also, I think when it's the first time it says tiyum, it has boser there. So what I'm thinking is it's a double one. You see sometimes with yolks, you see sometimes with fruit that it's a double fruit.
Tiyum, not
Yeah,
boser. You mean
tiyum.
tiyum?
It's in the same line with boser the first time.
Uh-huh.
So it doesn't grow just like with twin babies. They don't grow as much because two of them are growing together.
Uh-huh.
So it's not the full size.
Uh-huh. So it fits together. That's interesting. That's a nice little insight that you need to really so the Brisa says when it talks about it mentions tiyum and then it mentions boiser. So you want to say there's a close relationship between the two because it puts the two next to each other. Very nice. That's a nice little insight. Thank you, Jeffrey. Yeah. Wow.
Sure.
Okay. Very good. Okay.
Peace.
Take care, everyone. Sei gesund.